on Native American citizenship, suffrage, and sovereignty in history. Joining us today are two distinguished scholars, Dr. Lila Teeters Knolle and Dr. David J. Silverman. Dr. Knolle is a lecturer in Harvard University's History and Literature program. She holds degrees from Vassar College, from Columbia University, and the University of New Hampshire. In 2021, Lila was a J. Willard Hurst Fellow with the American Society for Legal History and the University of Wisconsin Law School, as well as a recipient of the Charlotte W. Newcomb Fellowship with the Institute for Citizens and Scholars. Her current project is entitled Native Citizens, the Fight Over Native American Citizenship in the U.S., 1887 to 1924. David Silverman is a professor of history at George Washington University, where he has taught since 2003. He's the author of several books on Native American, colonial American, and American racial history, including This Land is Their Land, the Wampanoag Indians, Plymouth Colony, and the Troubled History of Thanksgiving, which was published in 2019, and Thundersticks, Firearms and the Violent Transformation of Native America, which appeared under the Harvard University Press in 2016. He is currently writing a new book about Indigenous people and race-making in the United States history. Would you please welcome these distinguished scholars to the stage? We will hear their presentations, and then we will have an opportunity for questions. So, what? No, I'm going to sit right there, so I'll be able to see you.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for having me here today. I really consider it an honor to be here and amongst these scholars and activists. I've already learned a lot, and I'm looking forward to the conversations that happen over the course of the day. So as Jane said, I'm primarily a legal historian, and my specialty is the passage of the 1924 Indian Citizenship Act, also known as the Snyder Act. And when I started doing research into this legislation, the predominant understanding, at least among legal historians, was that by 1924, Native American citizenship in the US was relatively uncontroversial, and that Congress passed the legislation as a type of belated, patriotic response to Native American service during World War I. That citizenship was a belated gift to Native American people. And indeed, if you look at the congressional record of the debates surrounding the 1924 Act, you'll likely be convinced of this interpretation. There was hardly any debate over the 1924 Act. And the legislation was supported by the Department of the Interior, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and some of the most well-known Native Americans at the time, including Charles Eastman, Arthur Parker, Carlos Montezuma. It seemed as if there was this consensus that the time had come for Native American citizenship. But when we look beyond the immediate passage of the 1924 legislation, it's clear just how controversial Native American citizenship was in the United States in the decade preceding the Snyder Act. So for example, in the winter of 1923, many congressional representatives and Native American activists came to DC to form a committee of 100 to reflect on the state of Native American policy and to make recommendations to Congress and the Secretary of the Interior. In their final report, they noted that the American populace was largely in support of Native American citizenship. But they also noted, quote, the cold fact that every time a bill conferring citizenship has been introduced in Congress, Indians themselves have led in opposing them, end quote. The evidence, they said, was in congressional archives. And of course, historians and activists within Native communities have always known the duality of American citizenship. That on one hand, citizenship is a powerful tool that comes with essential rights that can help bolster sovereignty, but that it also can be coercive and threatening to sovereignty. So in my allotted time today, I thought I would talk a little bit about the controversy surrounding Native American citizenship in the lead up to 1924 as a way to understand why some Native Americans and some non-Natives thought that US citizenship was the best path forward for Native American nations and why others opposed it. And then I'll also sort of gesture towards how those debates continue to shape suffrage debates over the course of the 20th century. So as I alluded to, there are plenty of people who supported the legal and social integration of Native Americans into the American body politic. The primary indigenous activists were members of the Society of American Indians, which was a pan-Indian reform organization founded in 1911, and it worked closely with non-Native reform groups, Congress, and the Bureau to address corruption, policy changes, and the general well-being of Native American nations and individuals. They spent a lot of time in these halls. For many of the leaders of the society, such as President Charles Eastman, citizenship in the US was the best way to protect and ensure the future of Native Americans. For citizenship would open up greater access to the courts, would allow many Native Americans to serve on juries, and would make suffrage a greater possibility. They traveled around the nation, galvanizing non-Native Americans to write to their congressional leaders, urging them to support Native American citizenship. As society member, Chickasaw citizen, and US Congressman from Oklahoma, Charles Carter wrote, "Citizenship would be a, quote, simple act of justice to render to the Indian that which has long been due to him," end quote. Their efforts were incredibly successful. I really think that they are the linchpin in turning non-Native American sentiment pro-Native American citizenship in this period. And their efforts led to the passage of the 1919 Indian Veterans Act, which allowed Native veterans to apply for US citizenship. The other group eager to make Native American citizens was US congressional representatives. Before the 1924 Act, the primary way for Native Americans to become citizens was through the Dawes Act, or the General Allotment Act of 1887. This piece of legislation was determined to break up tribal reservations, tribal communities, and communally held lands. This was conceived of as a definite and purposeful blow to tribal sovereignty and tribal nations. I believe Dr. Silverman will talk more about the Dawes Act. Yes? Okay. But I just want to give you a brief overview of it so you can understand the importance. The act would allot each tribal member or head of family a specific parcel of land, and importantly, that allotment would be held in trust by the US government for 25 years, during which time the land would be immune from local and state taxation. The act also made allottees citizens of the United States. It's hard to overstate the effect of this legislation. Conceived as an assimilatory, progressive piece of legislation, it led to millions of land loss. And it attempted to strip Native Americans of their cultures and land practices. In 1906, Congress altered the terms of the Dawes Act through the Burke Act. We're going to get into some legal weeds here, but I urge you to stay with me. While the Dawes Act made Native American allottees citizens upon receiving the allotment, the 1906 Act delayed that until the trust period for the individual land allotment was terminated, meaning that now citizenship, taxation, and the end of the trust relationship, the personal trust relationship, all coincided at one moment. You could only become a citizen once you received the patent and fee for your allotment and you became vulnerable to taxation. Congress also declared that the 25-year trust period could be terminated early, so long as the Secretary of the Interior approved. So this meant that the Secretary could declare a Native American individual ready for citizenship, which would terminate the trust provision on an allotted land early, which would then make them liable to state and local taxation. And this could be done without an individual's consent or application for citizenship, and it could be done against their explicit wishes. For congressmen who lived in states with large Native American populations, particularly those that had been allotted, they now had the potential to open up a new, incredibly large tax base. And these congressmen were constantly hearing from constituents and their state government counterparts about how difficult it was for non-Native citizens to fund local governments in areas opened by the Dawes Act, quote-unquote, surpluses. Congress was being pushed by their constituents to release Indian land to taxation, and the Burke Act seemingly gave the Secretary of the Interior permission to do just that. So in other words, for many Native Americans, citizenship came to look like just another way to take Native American lands out of Indigenous possession. By 1917, it was Bureau policy to release Native Americans as quickly as possible from the trust, to make them citizens, to give them their patent and fee, to make them vulnerable to taxation. And citizenship was thus a way to appease citizens who were ideologically committed to Native American citizenship, right? Who saw Native Americans as being essential to American identity, and those who were driven by more material concerns. Against this backdrop, it's probably very easy to see the opposition to citizenship. And I want to emphasize in this next part about how Native American activism really changed citizenship policy in the United States. First, this will come as no surprise, there was sustained objection to impose citizenship because of the tax obligations that came along with it. And I want to be clear, this wasn't just shirking of small tax bills. These were large tax bills, and these tax bills and forced patenting, as this process came to be known, was incredibly destructive. Many Native Americans could not afford the taxes and would lose their land or other property as a result. Communities had counted on the 25-year trust period as a way to bolster resources and establish revenue. On some reservations, up to 90% of land that was forced patented would be lost. Resistance to forced patenting, to the early release of the trust and the imposition of citizenship was swift. The forced patents would appear by US certified mail, which often led to extended standoffs between Native American individuals and postal workers. And then also we have numerous court cases coming out of Indian country to fight forced patenting, which are ultimately successful. And by 1922, the courts have decided that forced patenting is an illegal process. Every citizenship bill introduced between 1887 and 1922 had allotment provisions included in it. Citizenship in this period was intimately tied with allotment and assimilation. But Native Americans, whether they were for or against citizenship, maintained Indigenous peoples' right to their culture and histories. And allotment threatened many tribal nations' ability to practice fully their cultures and to memorialize their histories. And of course, allotment would lead to taxation. One of the loudest and effective advocates against allotment in the name of cultural sovereignty was Pablo Abeyta of the Pueblo people. He met with congressional representatives repeatedly to reject citizenship because of the repeated reliance on allotment and the assimilation it represented. The Pueblo worked with many famous artists, including D.H. Lawrence, to publicize their protests, and this led to Congress abandoning at least 2 citizenship bills. It created a PR nightmare for Congress. And the last rejection of citizenship that I want to cover in this time came from the Haudenosaunee, or the Iroquois, and they're probably the most well-known for their rejection of US citizenship. And they rejected it based on political sovereignty and international law. Their tribal councils wrote many letters to Congress, personally or through lawyers, reminding Congress that imposing citizenship upon them would be a violation of their tribal sovereignty, a violation of treaties, an assault on international law. As one lawyer reminded Congress, quote, "They are independent nations, and they still have complete control over their internal affairs," end quote. The legacy of World War I hung heavy in these protests. One lawyer for the Haudenosaunee wrote, quote, "We proclaimed but yesterday the right of weak peoples to self-determination. We denounced but yesterday other peoples who broke their written treaties solemnly made and waged war on them for the deed. Were we hypocrites in search only for world praise?" End quote. The Haudenosaunee threatened to tie these issues up in courts. Lawsuits filed or threatened, public protests, the uproar made by these type of bills made passing Indian citizenship nearly impossible, as the Committee of 100 recognized in 1923. When the 1924 Act passed, it passed not because it was uncontroversial, but because it was done so swiftly and quietly, and it was a much different piece of legislation than what Congress had previously envisioned. There are 4 main changes I want to highlight. 1, the Citizenship Act did not remove tax protections early. 2, it did not have any sort of continued allotment provision in it. 3, it did not affect tribal citizenship status or claims to tribal property. And 4, it contained no cultural assimilation provisions, although I do want to recognize that obviously assimilationist pressures would continue and continue today. Of course, citizenship was still imposed, was still non-consensual, but it would be up to the next generation of Indigenous Americans to leverage that citizenship to not only preserve Indian sovereignty, but to strengthen it, and to fight for greater suffrage rights in the nation that declared them citizens. In a particularly cruel bit of irony, the very victories of 1924, the exclusion of early taxation provisions, and the continued ability to claim tribal status would become some of the major ways that states would try to limit Native American sovereignty. And so this is a fight that would continue from 1924 and that we're living with today. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. I'm honored to be on this program today with such luminaries, and I'm also humbled this morning, aware that I'm addressing a history that some of the people in this room have lived and whose ancestors have lived. I'd like to begin this morning by offering a theoretical and historical framework for approaching the subject of the Indian Citizenship Act. My theoretical framework, which I offer for those here and online who are unfamiliar with Indian country, is that Native Americans are not just another American racial or ethnic group, like African Americans, Asian Americans, Jewish Americans, or Irish Americans, for 2 central reasons. One is that they are indigenous, which is to say, they were here first. As such, They did not come into the United States voluntarily. The vast majority of them never asked to join it as full members. White people imposed the country on them. The history of Native peoples' relations with the United States has involved a constant struggle to defend the inherent sovereignty that comes with being indigenous. And by that I mean the right to self-governance, recognize territorial boundaries, and the power to engage with other foreign states. Put another way, the focus of Native peoples' aspirations, unlike, say, African Americans, has not been equal rights with white people, though most of them today certainly expect that status, but the exercise of the greatest sovereignty possible. The second central reason that Native people differ from other American racial and ethnic groups is that they are organized into polities, tribal nations, that govern their members and their territory, though the United States does not permit them to engage in foreign relations like other sovereign powers. These tribal nations exist not only by virtue of their members' inherent indigenous rights, but by virtue of recognition by the United States through Senate-ratified treaties, which under the Constitution are the supreme law of the land, and by Supreme Court rulings. Thus, tribal nations engage in government-to-government relations with the federal government, which makes Native people different than any other group in America. Against that background, I'd like to devote the rest of my time here to discussing the historical background to the Indian Citizenship Act, by contending that in the century plus preceding the Indian Citizenship Act, Native people experienced the granting of U.S. citizenship as a tool by which white people dispossessed and subjugated them, not as a gift promising equality and opportunity. From the country's very founding, U.S. authorities voiced the desire to Christianize, civilize, and absorb Native people into the nation in the hope that this offer would encourage Indians to surrender their land and authority voluntarily. American leaders also hoped that this program would lead posterity, which is to say us, to see some moral purpose in the country's expansion at Native expense. Precious few Native people took up the offer, not only because they found it unattractive on its face, but because they had witnessed white Americans' exploitation and even extirpation of Christian civilized Indians who tried, a pattern that stretched back into the 17th century, and I'd be happy to elaborate on that pattern in our discussion. In other words, from the start, Native people saw the fundamental problem in the utopian dreams of white reformers for Indian assimilation and citizenship. The main obstacle was not Indian opposition, formidable as it was, but the unwillingness of most white Americans to treat those they deemed as racial inferiors with dignity, never mind equality, no matter how culturally similar they were. This pattern played out repeatedly throughout the 19th century. The most glaring early examples came during the Indian removal period. Our histories of that dark chapter tend to overlook that most removal treaties, which were designed to make the process look voluntary, contain provisions to allow Native people to remain back east if they took up private property, accepted state law, and became citizens. Though a handful of moneyed elite Indians, generally of white ancestry, made good on this offer, the vast majority who took up the offer suffered plunder and murder at the hands of white mobs. This was the case, for example, for thousands of Creeks or Muskogees, whom Southern whites robbed of 2 million allotted acres and then drove west of the Mississippi in chains, in what can only be called an orgy of violence. 5,000 Choctaws, representing a quarter of their tribe, also suffered whites fleecing them of their allotments and the opportunity to remain in their natal homeland. State governments helped to orchestrate this pillage, while the federal government stood by and did nothing. The only place where Indians successfully became citizens was Wisconsin. There, several hundred Brothertown Indians and Stockbridge Mohicans took the citizenship and private property option, which they called becoming white, rather than relocate to Kansas, having already migrated from southern New England to escape white persecution. Some of them were confident that their status as civilized Christians equipped them to compete in white society, despite the obstacles of white race prejudice. Most of them spoke and wrote English. They governed their own churches. They ran sawmills, grist mills, farms, and logging operations. Quite a number of them had a command of white law. 3 of the Brothertown Indians would go on to serve in the Wisconsin legislature. Yet many of them came to regret the transition to citizenship, as white creditors, the taxman, and hucksters zeroed in on their allotments. 3 years into the experiment, most of the Stockbridge Mohicans petitioned to return their citizenship and revert back to the legal status as Indians. They have all their lives been called Indians, the Stockbridges appealed to Congress. It is their desire to continue, adding that their natures and their dispositions can no more be changed than their skins be made white and transparent. The Stockbridges did return their citizenship and managed to secure another reservation, which they retain to this day. The Brothertowns, who remained citizens, lost everything. In a state with a seal containing the Latin saying, "Civilization replaces barbarism," and depicting an Indian hunter retreating westward in the face of a white man guiding a plow. The pattern continued throughout the 19th century in the Midwest and the northern portion of federal Indian Territory, Kansas. Repeatedly, Native people facing dispossession tried to parlay the acceptance of private property and citizenship into the right to remain where they were. Hence, for example, the eponymously named Citizen Potawatomis of Oklahoma. By and large, not entirely, but by and large, the Native people who made these attempts were of mixed Indian white backgrounds, which they hoped would provide them with some measure of acceptance by the white majority. Their attempts are written across maps of this era in places called half-breed tracts. They're all over the Midwest. One enrolled member of the Kaw tribe, Charles Curtis, would parlay the profits from his half-breed allotment into a fortune that would contribute to him becoming a federal senator from Kansas and ultimately vice president under Herbert Hoover. Almost no one has heard of this guy, even among historians. That begs some conversation. Most Native people, though, found that citizenship was an empty promise. There were very few Charles Curtises out there. The United States intended reservations to be way stations on the road to assimilation, private property, and citizenship, not permanent homelands. But these places didn't function the way the US intended. In actuality, the federal government failed miserably in making these places reasonably decent places to live. It did not provide sufficient food to sustain people who could no longer support themselves through traditional means. Nor did it provide adequate farming implements and livestock to promote the transition to farming. It did not provide anywhere near sufficient medical care for people ravaged by diseases that preyed on their malnutrition, frayed psychologies, and poor sanitation. Its agents routinely bilked the people they were supposed to protect. And perhaps worst of all, and this is closely related to the issues of citizenship, the government did next to nothing as surrounding whites plundered the reservations of livestock, fencing, and firewood, trespassed on grazing lands, and trafficked in liquor. In other words, Native people could see plainly that the law bound but did not protect Indians, while it protected but did not bind whites. The government's plan to assimilate Indians toward incorporating them as citizens included forcing Native children to attend boarding schools, some on the reservations, others very far away. In these places, white authorities subjected the children to a daily regiment of military drills, roll calls, work details, and corporal punishment, with little time for rest and leisure. None of this resembled mainstream white American life. This was not preparation for participation in white America. The education was rudimentary and outrightly white supremacist, including the relentless message that the students' backgrounds were savage and inferior. Health conditions were abysmal, marked by sickness and death from communicable diseases at rates the government never would have tolerated for white people. Following school, most Native alums found no more acceptance in white society than if they had never attended school in the first place, and little opportunity to apply the skills they had learned on the reservation. It was during the reservation and boarding school regimes that Congress passed the Dawes Act of 1887 and the Curtis Act of 1898, named after the aforementioned Charles Curtis himself, to speed along the Indian transition to private property and citizenship. The Dawes Act authorized the division of Indian reservations into tracts, usually of 160 acres or less, and the allotment of those parcels among Native individuals. As we've already heard, there would be a 25-year restriction on the allottee selling the tracts to provide time for him or her to learn how to manage the land as a source of capital. Once that interim period elapsed, each Indian would receive a fee patent, lifting all restrictions on alienation, mortgages, and leases. From then on, again, just to repeat the point, and you have to say these things 12 times, the title holder would be responsible to pay property taxes and run the risk of having the tract confiscated for debt. Furthermore, he or she would become an American citizen. If the government judged the allottee to have become civilized before the end of the 25-year wait, he or she could be granted unrestricted ownership and citizenship early. As for the remaining undivided lands of the reservation, the government would purchase this surplus from the tribe and keep most of the proceeds as an interest-bearing account to fund its civilization programs, including the boarding schools. I find it a strange species of cruelty to have forced people to fund what amounted to the kidnapping and cultural reprogramming of their own children. As if to twist the knife further, the government's plan was to sell the Indian surplus territory to white homesteaders. The idea here was that by the time Indians became private property holding citizens, they would be enveloped by white society and ready to join it. Allotment legislation had been in the works for years as white reformers concluded that the reservations were failing to turn Indians into civilized yeomen, and as white economic interests zeroed in on the natives' remaining profitable resources. As early as 1876, the Commissioner of Indian Affairs was already questioning, and I quote, whether any high degree of civilization is possible without individual ownership of land, a notion that was reflective of the teachings of that era's anthropology. Over the next several years, white progressives who styled themselves as Friends of the Indians, gathering at an annual conference at Lake Mohonk in the upper Hudson River Valley, turned this principle into a mantra. In one of the conference series' more memorable speeches, Merrill E. Gates, the president of Amherst College, declared, "We by which he meant white reformers, must make the Indian more intelligently selfish before we can make him unselfishly intelligent. We need to awaken in him wants. Discontent with the teepee and the starving rations of the Indian camp in winter is needed to get the Indian out of the blanket and into trousers, and trousers with a pocket in them, and in a pocket that aches to be filled with dollars. Massachusetts Senator Henry Dawes, whose surname became synonymous with allotment, sensed little ache of this sort when he visited the Cherokees in 1885. One Cherokee officer boasted to him, and I quote, that there was not a family in the whole Cherokee nation that had not a home of its own. There was not a pauper in the nation, and the nation did not owe a dollar. It built its own capital and built its own schools and hospitals. In other words, leave us alone. But Dawes was unimpressed by the shared security afforded by the Cherokees' communal principles. They have gone as far as they could go, he judged, because they own their land in common. Consistent with the ideology of his Republican Party, Dawes wanted to see individuals striving for wealth to create a rising economic sea that lifted all boats. Practically every commissioner of Indian Affairs, from the late 19th through the early 20th centuries, agreed wholeheartedly with him, as did the vast majority of the many organizations created by the Friends of the Indians. Most Native spokesmen, and more than a few whites, including in Congress, insisted that this legislation would prove to be nothing more than a massive plundering of Indian land, and they were correct. It did not take 25 years after allotment for the pillage to begin, because during the interim period, the government repeatedly granted citizenship and the right to sell the land to Indians it deemed competent, which usually meant nothing more than those of mixed white Indian backgrounds. There had been more than 155 million acres of Indian land in 1881. By 1934, that number was 48 million. So 155 million acres to 48. 2/3 of Native people were left either completely landless or so land poor that they could not earn a subsistence. They became minorities on their own reservations, nowhere more so than in federal Indian territory promised to the removed tribes forever, where by 1907, when Oklahoma became a state, the number of whites stood at almost 550,000 compared to 80,000 African Americans and just 61,000 Native people. Superintendent of Indian Affairs, Charles Burke, surveying the wreckage in 1923, lamented, "A race of landlords has been transformed into a race of tenants." What I'm saying here is that the Allotment Act and the Allotment Acts and their supporting legislation had not turned Indians into white citizens. Instead, these measures became yet another example of how power in white America involved exploiting Native people with impunity while claiming to act in their benefit, reducing them to destitution, and then blaming them for the results. Virtually no white people during this entire era conceived of a system like we have now, in which tribal nations have secure land bases, exercise self-government, and practice their religious and cultural lives however they choose. Now, that vision almost certainly existed in the minds of some Native people before 1924, but not as a realistic political possibility, because whites simply would not consider it. The range of options were very, very narrow. Throughout American history, as far back as the colonial era, most white Americans had responded to Native American difference, quite frankly, with campaigns to exterminate them. The only dissenting voices from white America came from progressives of the day who conceived that Indians who became Christian and civilized could become citizens with all the same rights and responsibilities as white people. And here's the rub. These reformers would not confront that most of their fellow white Americans would not grant Native people that option. Nor would they consider the United States tolerating Native people living in their own way, on their own land, protected from white exploitation. They considered such a course to be just a slower path to extinction than outright extermination. The desperation of Native people in the face of these limited options, I contend, largely explains why some of them, like the acculturated, formally educated, and professionally accomplished Native people who founded the Society of American Indians in 1911, advocated for the Indian Citizenship Act. It helps to explain why some Native veterans of World War I did so too. Their options were meager. The only alternative they could conceive to the destitution of reservation life was full incorporation into the United States. I'll close just by noting, today things are different. The result of generations of Native American activism, lawyering, lobbying, and sheer resilience. It's also a result of at least enough white people being willing to listen. But I fear for the future. The current era's combination of Indian sovereignty and citizenship exists at the sufferance of an American majority and the will of Congress. I contend that the current status quo is not based on informed, principled public commitment to Indian self-determination, but instead on a passive acceptance of a state of affairs handed to us by lawmakers and activists in the 1970s. Most Americans know nothing about the history I've discussed here this morning. Most Americans know nothing about the current state of Indian country and its place within American federalism. Even if Americans did possess this knowledge, I fear that a sizable portion of them would revert to the position of reformers in the 19th and early 20th century, that Native American difference is unacceptable and even dangerous, or that Native American sovereignty is somehow a special handout rather than an inherent indigenous right. My pessimism is grounded in an awareness of this country's history and the current state of our society. Thanks.
Well, you've certainly given us much to think about. This is our moment to have questions. If you from the audience have questions, please. I think we have someone with a mic. Cards. We have cards. Okay. This is Katie Ryan and Sam Holliday, who are the two key staff members who have been putting this together. So raise your hand, and they will bring you a card to write your question on. And while we do that, we have been joined by the artist that I told you about. Cedar, would you stand up? This is Cedar Hunt, who is the artist. Comes to us from Montana and even brought her mother. So we welcome Cedar and her mom. And if you get an opportunity to talk to her, the piece is got a whole sense of history. It's ledger art, and it is imposed on the kind of ledgers that were required for so many Native people that somehow white folks felt like the Native people couldn't handle their own finances, so there was a ledger that they had to go to get their own money. And that's a little bit of the story. But Cedar will be with us for a while, so take a moment to talk to this talented young woman. Okay, question. During the 1924 Federal Citizenship Act considerations, did the legislation consider any state-level barriers that was any of that taken into consideration?
Sure. So, as I mentioned, the debates in Congress are pretty sparse when it comes to the 1924 Act. However, what does come up is how the act will affect suffrage for Indigenous people. And so that sort of propels Congress to a conversation of state-level legislation. And Snyder, the man who bears his name on the piece of legislation, assured congressmen that the act would not change any state legislation affecting Native suffrage. So that's one way that it comes up.
Professor Silverman?
And I would also add that, we need to be careful not to conflate the granting of citizenship with the exercise of equal rights. Even after the Indian Citizenship Act, states like New Mexico and Arizona continued to prohibit Native people from voting. They didn't gain that right in those states until after World War II. Receiving citizenship didn't mean justice. There have been civil rights commissions that have focused on the unequal application of justice, or we might say the unequal application of injustice, in states like South Dakota, Arizona, and New Mexico. These commissions have conducted these investigations almost every decade from the 1940s onward, and they're patterns that have become all too familiar to us in the context of the Black Lives Matter movement. But all of those issues apply to Native America as well. Even in states where Native people theoretically or legally had the right to vote, there's a distinct pattern of white obstruction of Native people's access to the polls, which if anyone is following the news, is a pattern that has continued up to this very time. So, to sum it up, we need to be very careful not to conflate citizenship with legal and social equality.
And we have another question from the audience. Would you discuss, and some of this will come up in our later panels, but you're the first off the bat, so you get the first, the first hit. Would you discuss the significance of the various strategies that tribal nations and activists are employing in the citizenship struggle, both historically and currently, and the unique relationship between nations that we have?
I'll leave the current struggle to the people who are fighting it. They know far more about it than I do, certainly. What I can say historically is that Native people in the early 20th century are in such a desperate strait that they are grasping for any means to protect what little they had left. And the thrust of my talk was to have us confront what a narrow band of options there were. The conception that Native people could simultaneously be citizens and sovereign nations did not exist in hardly any white people's minds. It almost certainly existed in Native people's minds, but it wasn't even part of the discussion. The state of reservations, by and large, was so abysmal that some Native people said, the only other possibility here is to get with the mainstream, to try to integrate and hope against hope against historical patterns, that doing everything white people ask will lead to some measure of justice and dignity in the public square. That was, and that was an experience that very few of them were able to realize. Again, not because of their own shortcomings, because of the white supremacy of the majority American population.
Yeah, I would add as well that I think we're also in the midst of sort of reevaluating the 1920s as a time of Native American activism, right? As Dr. Silverman has emphasized, there was this very small band of possibilities for Native American peoples facing overwhelming odds for a country that was bent on the destruction of their tribal nations. However, I think their activism it really helps set up the future generations, right? There's an establishment of tools that becomes very helpful. So, for example, the cultural work that the Pueblo are doing, that people like Charles Eastman are doing, that is really trying to explain to non-Native Americans the intrinsic value of Native American culture, ideas, histories. They're pretty successful in making inroads to populations that had been wildly hostile to their rights. So, for example, the Pueblo are able to create a coalition that really is able to protect a lot of cultural practices. And I think you can call it like the PR move, right? Actually helps set up some of the conversations that come later in the 20th century that have their own drawbacks, which I'm happy to talk more about at some point. Another sort of strategy I would highlight is this appeal to international law that the Haudenosaunee capitalize on. It's not effective in the United States context in 1924. However, if you know anything about the Haudenosaunee, you'll know that their lands are surrounded by two settler colonial nations, Canada and the United States. Both of those nations, by no coincidence, are trying to impose citizenship on Native populations at the time. The Haudenosaunee, surrounded by Canada, go to the League of Nations and say, this is why you are founded. This is a violation of international law. Stand up for us. They don't. However, it sets a precedent of tribal nations using international organizations as a way to bolster claims to tribal sovereignty that we'll see manifest a little bit more productively in the 1950s and obviously 1970s and onward. And then also in terms of this idea of tribal sovereignty existing alongside US citizenship, I think there's a way that we can read US court cases like US v. Nice, some of the taxation cases that I referenced before, as certainly not intending to leave the door open for sort of almost like a dual citizenship situation, or for a way for people to hang on to tribal nationhood while also being members of the US. There's a way that those cases are sort of providing a precedent that Native peoples can use later on to say, look, in 1916, the US Supreme Court said that tribal belonging is not in conflict with US citizenship. And that is a way that can sort of manifest greater rights in the latter of half of the 20th century.
We got another question from the audience, and this will give you a sense of what our audience is like. The title of the law was an act to authorize the Secretary of Interior to issue certificates of citizenship to Indians. Are there any extant certificates, and what do those certificates say? Do you know?
Yeah, so this is one of the great mysteries of the 1924 Acts, right? The mismatch of the name, which seems very narrow in its ambition, and then the text, which makes all Native Americans in the territorial United States citizens. Honestly, I don't have a great answer for that. And if anyone here does, please come find me. But my understanding is that Congress is really trying to handle the fallout from that 1922 decision, which ends forced patenting. And so they're dealing with revoking a lot of patents that were forced, and while also trying to impose citizenship on certain natives. It's a real sort of like crisis moment for Congress in 1922 to 1926 as they deal with the fallout from this. As far as certificates, the certificate is actually just your patent and fee. It's just the title to your land. So yes, you can find them. They're online. And in terms of what's sort of ironic about this is in the period that I was talking about before, there was actually no paperwork that could confirm an Indigenous person's status as a U.S. citizen. So it led to this, again, another crisis where sometimes Native Americans would try to claim rights that were inherent in citizenship, but without proof of citizenship, it became very hard to do that. And the Bureau of Indian Affairs was only marginally helpful in providing people with evidence of their citizenship status.
I'd like to note that the granting of these certificates, when they were delivered to Native people in reservation settings, very often was accompanied by a ritual, which will drive home the point that I was making earlier, that in most white Americans' minds, private property holding, civilization, were inextricable from citizenship. So the ritual would involve a Native man emerging from a teepee, shooting an arrow off into the distance, and then dropping the bow and going to a plow and putting his hands on it. And sometimes, they'd raise an American flag. It speaks to the point.
Okay, we're going to do one more question, and then we'll take a break. So for those of you who are in person, we're going to take a break, reconvene at 11 o'clock. For our onliners, we'll be back at the podium at 11 o'clock. For those of you who are here in person, we have coffee and a little snacks and an opportunity for you to talk informally with one another. So we've got 2 questions. So I'm going to give you 2 questions to answer together, and they don't really go together, so you can, roll with this. One is that one of our audience members was thinking about his own experience visiting Indian reservations in 1968 when he was dispatched as part of a congressional outreach to look at the impact of the war on poverty, to see if it was making any headway in Native country. And so, do you have any thoughts about that? And then on a more contemporary question, one of our audience members suggests that perhaps there's some similarities to the Russian invasion of Ukraine to take that land that might be analogous to the white settlers coming onto the native land. So if you would like to take either one of those questions, please.
I can take a stab at both of them. The war on poverty is actually an important moment in the beginning of the modern era of Native sovereignty and self-determination. And the reason that's the case is that federal funds began to be funneled through tribal government rather than through federal agents. And that forced many tribal nations to create the apparatus to receive, distribute, and track those funds. So that's an important moment. I'm no expert on Russian-Ukrainian affairs, but as an informed person, I've read enough to know that like most nations that invade other nations, the aggressor nation has a historical mythology to justify the aggression. That was certainly the case in the United States, where the ideology of manifest destiny, the notion that God destined white America to expand at indigenous expense in order to spread democracy, Christianity, opportunity, in short, Western civilization, was a galvanizing force. It served to justify all of the horrors that expansion entailed. And let's be clear about what I mean by horrors. These were wars of extermination against Native communities that targeted women, children, and the elderly. Make no mistake about it. And the idea, again, was that God blessed this endeavor. So, yes, there are certainly parallels.
And Lila supports it. So we have for each of you a small gift from the society. The gifts are paperweights that are models of the Capitol made from marble that was from the Capitol. When they did the restoration, they gave us some of the Capitol steps marble, and we have made it into these things, and we hope you will display that in your offices and remember that we are so grateful for the time you spent with us and for being with us today. Thank you so very much. One of the things that you may not all know is that there is a special committee in the United States Senate that is dedicated to Indian affairs. The Indian Affairs Committee is currently chaired by Brian Schatz of Hawaii, and we are honored to have as the moderator for this panel the Majority Staff Director,